in just a second a quick survey that I would love for everyone. Whoop, I guess it went in. Just that first link that says pre-presentation survey. If everybody could spend 1 minute and click on that and knock through those questions, and give you just a minute or two to do that. And just to introduce myself, thank you, Claire. My name is Debbie Burnt. This program was developed from a youth prevention perspective, and it looked at the high school and the middle school environment, and looked at and realized that athletes are a big part of that environment, and wanted to figure out what is substances really doing specifically for an athlete or to an athlete. And from there, this program was created. It's about 1.5 years old. So we're really happy to be with you right now. While you're continuing to work on the survey, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Yeah, maybe. All right. Okay. So we should be at the second slide. If you're not seeing the second slide, raise your hand. But like I said, we looked at high school and we realized that 50 to 60% of students are playing a sport. If you look nationally, that will end up being a lot higher in some locations, obviously. Athletes do have a lot of influence in school culture, how the school sees itself. And we know that every athlete has a very unique role to play on their team and is important to the team's success. And a team really needs every athlete to be at their best. A second. All right, there we go. So what's the value for athletes in being substance free? Well, first of all, just they have optimal physical and mental health. They can perform at their maximum athletic potential. The team can perform at its highest level possible. And there can be real team bonding, which is such an exciting and fun and important part of high school athletics. And what we know is that substance use hurts all of that. We know that athletes have to make decisions about drugs and alcohol in high school. All students do. But in that athletic space, it's important to know that there's 3 stakeholders, right? There's the athlete himself, him or herself, and their teammates, their coaches, and their parents. We also know that the NCAA, if anyone's interested in playing collegiate sports, the NCAA recognizes these stakeholders, and they are very prevention focused. If you think about who they govern, college kids, only a small percentage of college kids are 21 and above, or less than a third typically. So they don't need any of their athletes using. And even if something's legal, they don't consider it permitted. So we're going to jump into the substances and what's the big deal anyway? How do we need to understand these substances? But before we do that, I also was going to launch a poll, and I am not seeing it. I'm wondering, Claire, can you launch that poll? Or Kristen? There we go. Thanks. So just tell us a little bit about yourself. We want to know who's in the audience. In Zoom land, you don't always get to know. So what best describes you, number 1, and number 2, if you play a sport, which ones do you play? And then there's a couple of other, if you don't play a sport, there's a few other things in there to list. So I'm going to spend 1 minute letting everybody vote or click. And Claire, I would just ask, when you see most of everybody chiming in, if you could just show us the results. A lot of stuff to fill out here this morning. I guess it's morning where I am in California, afternoon on the East Coast. Do we have results? All right. All right, so we have mostly high school students and athletes on. Great, glad to have you. Actually, I guess we have mostly other and some high school athletes. And then basketball, lacrosse, performing arts are our main games and or sports. Good to know. Okay, so so let's talk about substances. Like I said, what is the big deal anyway? And sorry that for some reason, there we go. All right, so let's talk about alcohol first. Most of this is just information that really the adults in our lives don't understand. The teens the teens don't understand either. So we're just kind of start with some basics. First of all, alcohol is a depressant, and it water soluble. So alcohol and its impacts on the athlete are primarily physical impacts. So it affects, these are the things that it affects. Metabolism, so it constricts aerobic metabolism, which reduces an athlete's endurance. It makes weight difficult to maintain. Depending on your metabolism, that may mean it makes it harder to lose or harder to gain weight. It inhibits the absorption of nutrients, which decreases an athlete's endurance, decreases protein synthesis for muscle fiber repair, and it increases the risk of injury. We're going to see this theme kind of throughout these substances. The impact to repair and recovery is pretty predominant. It also disrupts sleep and dehydrates, as we know. It impacts performance within, or aerobic performance within 24 hours of activity. And we know that just even weekly consumption will double the impact or double the rate of injuries that we see for athletes. So let's switch and talk about marijuana. So unlike alcohol, it's considered to be more of a hallucinogen in the fact that it distorts time and space. It causes impairment in a very specific way. It spoofs what's called the endocannabinoid receptor system and the transmitters that run on that, and disrupts brain function from that in that way. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then marijuana is fat soluble, where we said alcohol was water soluble. And so just to give you a little comparison, when you drink something and it does all kinds of whack things in your brain, within 24 to 30 hours, that alcohol has washed out of your system through excretory systems like urination and breathing and sweating. Marijuana is quite different. It's a fat soluble toxin. It's lipophilic. So the way it works, you smoke marijuana or you consume an edible, the THC, and hopefully everybody knows what THC is. It's the cannabinoid in marijuana that makes a person high. Gets into the bloodstream, goes to the brain, makes a person high. And while they're still high, their body will start pulling THC out of their bloodstream and storing it in their fatty tissues. Once they're done being high and they are more at stasis, their body will start leaching that THC back into their bloodstream to be carried to those excretory systems to be eliminated. And it's the way your body handles any kind of a fat toxic load. What's interesting, if you've ever heard someone say they tested positive for marijuana weeks after they used it, this is why. That low level of THC in the bloodstream can get picked up by drug tests. And it's actually a really low level of impairment. Most people can cognitively rise above it. A person would not seem high while that process is going on in their bodies. But if they were to take really sophisticated or finely tuned memory tests or physical tests, that impairment might show up on those tests. So what that tells us is that even weekend use of marijuana can start to compromise skill and performance improvements all week long. So we like to spend the other thing that we know about marijuana is that it affects the athlete in a more neurological way, whereas alcohol was more physical. And so let's talk about that for a minute, because really your brain is probably your most important athletic tool. And your brain is remarkable. The brain you go to bed with is not the same brain you woke up with this morning, as one of my favorite statements by a neurologist. And it speaks about elasticity. So what that means is your brain's highly adaptive, and all day long it's changing. You do anything in your day and you get all this feedback through your five senses, goes up into your brain, turns into knowledge, and gets stored into memory with everything you learned a minute ago, last week, last year. And you create this kind of arc of understanding of how the world works and who you are in that world. And so if you think about what you're doing from an athletic standpoint, you're conditioning and practicing and playing, and you're getting feedback about your sport and about your performance all the time. That the same thing happens with that feedback, goes through your five senses, goes into your brain, gets turned into knowledge and stored into memory. So in athletics, you are creating this athletic knowledge, like a physical and an intellectual repository of how to play your sport. So a little more on marijuana. Understanding how it works, as I mentioned before, we need to understand the endocannabinoid receptor system. We actually have naturally occurring cannabinoids that our brain manufactures when it needs them. Anandamide is one of those, and THC will knock anandamide off of that endocannabinoid receptor system and take over it, interfering with anandamide's role. And in fact, if you look at the molecular structure of anandamide and THC, you see that they're pretty similar. Let me back up. Whenever I have this conversation, really with teens or with parents, someone will always say, so if marijuana, THC, is doing something natural, or doing that my body naturally does, doesn't that make it better for me in some ways? And the short answer is no. And in fact, it probably makes it a little worse because of something called homeostasis. This is a brain cell. And so neurotransmitters go through a brain cell, they cross the synaptic gap, they get picked up on the receiving side of the brain cell, and then they cruise on through the brain. So when a brain gets flooded with too much THC or too many cannabinoids through THC, it will have a response. And one of those responses is to start shutting off the receptors on the receiving side of that brain circuit. And in fact, that is a very physiological event. If we look at an MRI of a non-using 16-year-old versus a daily user who's 16 years old, you'll see a real difference in their brains. These holes are not actually holes, but they're where neural activity has slowed way down and where blood flow in the brain has slowed way down. So how important is this endocannabinoid system? What does it signal? You'll hear the system, or you'll hear CB1 and CB2 receptors. That language refers to this system. You have those receptors all over your entire body. But if we look at your brain, you have major concentrations of those receptors in 6 major areas. And what that tells us is those 6 areas need anandamide in the right levels to function properly. So what are they? Interestingly, they're a lot about athletics. So let's run through it real quick. One of them is the hippocampus, which is all about memory storage, memory retrieval, memory elimination. Another one is the frontal lobes, where ideas are sparked and where they're held in what's called working memory. The basal ganglia is all about body organization. So if you're an athlete and you have this thought, go catch that ball, that fires off in your frontal lobes and it's held in working memory for a moment. Your brain goes out to the hippocampus and retrieves everything it knows about catching a ball, brings it back, and the basal ganglia starts to organize your body to take that action. Then, as you're taking that action, the cerebellum kicks in and it starts refining your motor process. So it'll make tighten your angle, slow your speed, so you can actually finish that activity. So you can see from an athletic standpoint, the endocannabinoid system is really important. Then there's another part of the brain called the amygdala, which is all about emotional processing and the feeling of connection and excitability and awe. And there's this thing called virtual newness that'll fire through the amygdala where, and you might have heard someone who's been high tell a story like, you know, while I was high, I had this chocolate chip cookie and it was the best chocolate chip cookie I've ever had. Well, what's happened is their brain has failed to go get all their memories about chocolate chip cookies. So they're having this virtually new experience. And in reality, that chocolate chip cookie may be the worst chocolate chip cookie they've ever had. It may be an average chocolate chip cookie, but that feedback can get stored into memory like any other feedback. And you can see where you can, if that happens enough times, you can start to have distorted understanding. And that could be distorted understanding about your sport, for example, right? If you were either high while playing, which hopefully no one ever is, or even in that removal process where you're getting just a little low level of impairment. So then moving on to the nucleus accumbens, that's the sixth area that's impacted by cannabinoids. That is all part of your pleasure reward pathway. It's where dopamine is fired off. It's one of the reasons why we know marijuana is addictive, because anything that activates the nucleus accumbens has the potential to be addictive. It's why we don't get addicted to things like antibiotics. So let's watch a quick video on marijuana. Okay, so that kind of summarizes marijuana for us. So moving on to nicotine, we've had a depressant, we've had essentially a hallucinogen, and now we have a stimulant.
Debbie,
Nicotine.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we couldn't hear. There was no sound in the video.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for 1 minute and reshare and make sure it's a good video. We won't rewatch it, but okay, share computer sound. Let me just make sure I've got that. Okay, so we have one more video. I'll ask you guys before I let it roll if you're hearing it in a minute. Can everyone see the nicotine screen? Is that what people are seeing right now? Yes, no?
Yes, that's what we see. Yep.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so like I said, nicotine is a stimulant and it doesn't intoxicate necessarily, but it takes over the adrenal system and it absolutely can addict. We're back to water solubility. Nicotine is water soluble. Okay, for some reason, I'm just having the hardest time moving slides around. Sorry about this, guys. It's just not, look at my screen's not active. Okay, there we go. So the effects of nicotine are physical. You get an artificial stimulation of the neuromuscular junction. So what does that mean? You get this immediate burst of energy through the adrenal system. It quickly resolves, which leads to kind of a physiological lethargy or exhaustion. And then your body immediately craves it again. So this is what makes this quick cycle is one of the things that makes nicotine really addictive. It also causes the narrowing of your blood vessels, which is called vasoconstriction. From an athlete standpoint, what that means is it increases your blood pressure, decreases the blood flow to your heart, causes an irregular rhythm for your heart, increases your heart rate and places this overall greater load on your heart, which is what athletics is already doing. So it's compounding that. If a person is consuming via their lungs, and that's consuming anything, so that's smoking or vaping, it's smoking or vaping nicotine or THC, you're creating this repetitive bronchodilation in your lungs, and that has real impact. It reduces your capacity to take in oxygen over time. It decreases the amount of oxygen in your bloodstream. The air you're breathing has less oxygen in it because it has the smoke or the aerosol in it. And things like carbon monoxide are binding to your blood instead of oxygen and carrying that to your muscles and your tissues instead of oxygen. It also causes this release of enzymes that breaks down or slows the synthesis of collagen. And again, we're back to that healing. The act of athletics is you're always tearing down tissue. You're always tearing down your muscles and tearing down tendons, and you're always rebuilding. And there's a lot of growth and strength that comes in that. But if you're interrupting that process, you're compromising that build. So athletes who use who use via their lungs have less endurance. They tend to recover more slowly, heal more slowly. They're generally weaker. And in most cases, they will get injured more easily than their non-smoking peers. Okay, so those are the three majors, right? And I want to spend 1 minute talking about opioids. Athletes tend to encounter prescription opioids through injury. People may have heard of Oxycontin, Vicodin, Percocet. The thing we want athletes to know is that these drugs are highly addictive. They can be important in the recovery process, but you want to stay very aware on how they're affecting you. You don't want to get overprescribed, and you always want to dispose of these drugs properly. The CDC has a great flyer that they make for all people and teens, and you'll have access to it in a minute. One comment about street drugs. So heroin, which most everybody's heard of, is an opioid. It and all street drugs, cocaine, methamphetamines, ecstasy, Molly, they're all becoming extremely dangerous because of something called fentanyl and carfentanil. These are really hyperpotent opioids that get added to street drugs. Sometimes you can be, buying even an Adderall that you buy off the street, and it can just be fentanyl. The street manufacturing world is not regulated or overseen in any way. So we just want all teens to understand how lethal street drugs have become in the last 3 years. And lastly, we want to talk about addiction. All teens need to protect themselves. Athletes, you do as well. We know that 90% of adult addicts started using something before they were 18. They started drinking, smoking marijuana, smoking cigarettes, doing stronger drugs before they were 18. So you have a tremendous opportunity to protect yourself from addiction as a young person. We know that addiction is a chronic disease. If someone becomes addicted, not very many addicts actually end up in recovery. Organizations like Herren are doing, such a great job trying to increase that. Then once an addict gets into recovery, they fall in and out of it pretty regularly. And achieving long-term sustainable sobriety is really a challenge, and definitely doable, but a challenge. And even if you get to long-term sustainable sobriety, it's still something that the addict manages every single day. So it's a chronic disease. It's more like a diabetes than it is other kinds of diseases. We know that your brain's not fully developed till you're 26. And we also know that if addiction runs in your family, young people have a 50% greater chance of becoming addicts themselves. So addiction in families is really complicated. And some families are very open and very verbal, and everybody's talking about it and everybody knows. In other families, that's not the case. If you're in one of those families and you think there might be addiction in your family and nobody's talking about it, you have a variety of options. You can start talking about it, but you don't need to. Your play to protect yourself is to delay the use of substances well into your young adult life. To give you some examples of addiction rates, alcohol, People who consume alcohol, about 15 to 20% of them are considered to have a use disorder of some sort. 30% of people that consume marijuana on a every 30-day basis. We look at users of these drugs as if they've used in the last 30 days, not if they've ever tried it. And then nicotine, 85% of people that consume nicotine likely have a use disorder, right? That's kind of tricky. Vaping today makes a lot of kids in particular think that they're just casual users. They can kind of hit it here and there, but in reality, about 10 to 15% of those casual users are actually casual. The rest of us will struggle getting off nicotine. So this is the next video. Let me know if you guys can hear it. Oh, and actually, it just popped me to a browser. So let me know if you can see it as well.
We can see
it's important to understand that
all
everyone
good.
All good? Okay, great.
All good.
in the world has addictions, or rather natural addictions, to things that are good, like food, water, and sleep. These natural addictions are important for our health and survival, and without them, we would not hunger or crave the things we need to survive. Now, we aren't exactly born with these natural addictions. Our body creates them. Let's look at an example. When you bite into an apple, your brain says, "Yum." Your brain recognizes that this apple is good for you. It has nutrition, vitamins, and gives your body the energy it needs to survive.
Debbie, the video
Whenever the
isn't
brain
playing,
recognizes something that's good,
but we
it
can hear
releases
it.
Okay. Are you seeing my slides, or are you seeing, does it look like a video's embedded in the slides?
We can see the slide behind it and the video on top, and it played, like you could hear it, but the video itself wasn't moving.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and see if I can reshare this. Okay. You see a browser now?
Yep.
Okay, let's try this.
chemical called dopamine.
There we go. Perfect.
Dopamine causes you to experience pleasure. It's what makes you feel good, like when biting into an apple. The brain releases this dopamine in order to teach the body that this is healthy and good for your survival, and that it should remember to do it again. Now, there are other things we do that can release the pleasurable dopamine, like playing video games, exercising, or reading a good book. However, the amount of dopamine released during these activities is less than what's released when we eat food. The brain does this so it can recognize which is more important. So if you go 2 days without reading a book, or 2 days without eating food, your body is going to crave the food over the book. As such, your brain creates what's called a hierarchy of survival, which ranks how important each of these things is to your survival. Now, there are some things that will not cause the release of dopamine, like eating soap or punching yourself in the face. The brain knows that these things are not good, and therefore does not release the pleasurable dopamine because your brain does not want you to do it again. Now, let's look at alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, and other drugs. These are all classified carcinogens, proven to cause cancer and other fatal diseases. Now, your brain should recognize that these things are harmful to your body. However, these substances have special chemical characteristics that fool the brain into releasing dopamine, oftentimes in much greater amounts than the body has ever experienced before. Because of this, the body is fooled into thinking that these things are good and important, sometimes even more important than food, water, or sleep, and consequently hijacks the #1 spot in your survival hierarchy. So now, if you go 2 days without eating or 2 days without drinking alcohol, your body will actually crave the alcohol over the food. This is an extreme case of addiction, where the person addicted believes that they will die if they don't get it. The severity of the addiction depends on where the alcohol or drug lies within your hierarchy of survival, and can increase even with casual use. Research shows that people under the age of 21 are at the highest risk of having their survival hierarchy hijacked. Why? Because their brains are still growing and developing and are hypersensitive to false shocks of dopamine caused by these harmful substances. By 21, the brain is more fully developed and mature, and the survival hierarchy becomes more permanent and less susceptible to getting hijacked. The flip side is that once you are 21, it becomes very difficult to remove these harmful substances from your survival hierarchy. Studies show that 9 out of 10 people who currently struggle with addiction started drinking, smoking, or using before the age of 21. Understanding addiction as a preventable disease can help save millions of lives. The decision to wait until 21 could mean the difference between a life enslaved by addiction or a life full of success and accomplishment. Want to learn more? Visit us at wait21.org.
Okay, great. So I'm going to reshare the screen here. And so, it's a good summary for the addiction process. And let me see if I can get to my next slide. Okay, hold on. I have not had this many technical difficulties, I think, ever presenting on Zoom. Okay, so final slide. So whenever we're talking to teen athletes, data tells us that a majority of high school kids are actually not using substances, which is sometimes feels contrary. But if you're looking at the, monitoring the future study, it says that a majority are not. However, we know some are. And so if you are using substances, it's a real simple thing. Stop. And the good news in that is the same thing that makes your brain more vulnerable to substance use. Its adaptability and elasticity is the same thing that can make it easier to stop now. And if there is any structural damage that has started to occur in a young brain, it's also the thing that can start repairing that damage. We want kids to know what withdrawal feels like. So if you've ever had a friend who's tried to stop vaping nicotine, you may have already seen it. That is a hard thing to do. It is a week or two of really kind of intense agitation. If a person can power through that, that agitation starts to decline over time. Alcohol is more of a rolling withdrawal with real highs, real lows, depending on how much someone consumes. And then marijuana is a little tricky. So because of that lipophilic nature, so that THC is not leaving a person's system right away, withdrawal is really delayed. It can be 3-4 weeks out before THC fully leaves someone's system and someone might be fully experiencing withdrawal. So that can be hard for people who smoke because they'll stop for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks and kind of start to feel uncomfortable 3-4 weeks later and are like, I don't really have a problem with this because I haven't used in 3 weeks. But in reality, they're just getting to the withdrawal phase. And the last comment is, if stopping is difficult, get help. Don't think you have to live on that roller coaster, that start-stop roller coaster. And in the high school world, there tends to be quite a few places for help. Obviously, Herren is a phenomenal one. Lots of schools have wellness centers and counselors and school nurses, and then your coaches and your parents are also good resources. So that is the Substance-Free Athletic Substances message, and would love to hear from anyone. If you have questions, if you need additional information, I'm going to pop a post survey into the chat. And then also wanted to just focus on and let you guys know that we do have a, oh gosh, I can't do anything here at the same time, but we do have a Substance-Free Athletic Instagram account. I would love for everyone to start following us. So any questions out there? And I also have the pleasure of bringing on Kristen Young, who is the clinical psychologist with Herren. And Kristen, do you want to introduce yourself in any way as well?
Sure. I'm the Director of Clinical Services for Herren Project. I'm actually a licensed independent clinical social worker in the state of Massachusetts. I work with families and individuals all day long at Herren. So if you have any questions related to how to get help, what the process is like, feel free to shoot those out. Also work with lots of families who are struggling to try to get their loved ones to want help. So willing to field any questions related to that. And I have a private practice and I work with a lot of teenagers. So I also have a teenager. So, willing, if anybody has any questions related to any of that, I'm here. I'm willing to try to answer them. You did have one comment, Debbie. Did you see that?
I am not seeing it. If you would
Okay, it
share, that'd
says,
be great.
thank you. I'm a mom. This was so clear. So
Oh,
more of a
awesome.
comment than a question.
Fabulous. I appreciate that. You know, we have spent a lot of time trying to really get information out there that that's useful. And you know, the just say no doesn't work. You need to know why. You know, what is the big deal, especially when you have this huge media onslaught promoting all kinds of substance use, and influencers promoting all kinds of substance use. I mean, there has to be an answer, right? So we're always trying to figure out what is the clearest way to explain substances for teens.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. And I agree. This was awesome.
thank you.
Thank you for giving
I do. Okay. Yes, I'm a teacher. I'm seeing this now, teacher, coach, and parent of a teen. This was helpful. This is great. Our program does love, we actually have a little program for each of those stakeholders, and essentially all the same information is conveyed, but we expanded a little bit for parents. We expanded a little bit for coaches. Coaches are so important in an athlete's life, and they have this incredible influence, and they have this really unique position, and just helping coaches understand how and if they're coaching drugs and alcohol can be really powerful too.
And we've had a couple questions in the meantime, Debbie, about whether or not this will be able to be accessed. And I just want to let everybody know that this it has been recorded and it will be available up on the Herren Project's YouTube channel. So you just go to YouTube and do a search for Herren Project, and this webinar, as long as many others, will be up there for you to use whenever you want to access them.
That is awesome. And then I would point people on the slide. Our website's pretty straightforward, substance-free-athletics.org. Email info@, and then again, our Instagram account, which is run by teen athletes. And it's
that's awesome.
It's really exciting. You know, kind of trying to give athletes a space who aren't using to have some camaraderie, give athletes a space that are using to, you know, find other people and be in conversation. So that launched pretty recently, just in November. So it's just getting going, but it's a great place.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to throw out there too, if any of your loved ones are struggling with this, you know, especially your teens, or if you yourself are struggling and you've tried to stop and you can't. You know, Debbie at one point mentioned that the brain starts to learn that you need these substances, almost like you need air for survival. It can be very hard to stop alone. So please ask for help. We have all kinds of resources, all sorts of places you can go. Just go to our website, herrenproject.org. Go to a teacher, go to a coach, go to somebody and have a conversation, because it is very difficult to stop all by yourself if you've been using any of these substances for any significant amount of time. So please don't be afraid to ask for help. It doesn't mean that you're weak. It means it's biology. It's a normal thing if you've been using these to have a difficult time stopping.
Great.
We have another question. Your thoughts on running events that serve alcohol? Oh, I don't know why that serve alcohol at the finish line. Many young athletes participate in these, and it seems to send the wrong message.
Yeah, I think if it's at high school event that served alcohol at the finish line, I would probably get in touch with that event coordinator pretty quickly and get that to stop. That's just patently illegal. You know, that you can't do that. But if you're talking about collegiate events, actually shouldn't be serving alcohol either, at least in the athlete space. I know there's lots of organizations that have that ongoing debate. Are we serving alcohol in the football stadium or not? Not wanting to get into that. But if it's, you know, if it's a professional event, it's tough, right? I mean, it's like, what do you tell your kids when, you know, all the athletes are drinking, all the athletes are, you know, having a cigar and celebrating huge, you know, championship kind of wins. And that's where, you know, as a parent, figuring out what your opinions are, where your voice is, having conversations ongoing with your kids, taking all those opportunities, those teachable moments, opportunities to say, what do you think about that? You know, and get your kids talking about what their opinions are on substances is at least one response to it.
Yeah, and trying to model as much as we can.
Yeah, we, yeah, I talk to a lot of high school parents, and it's uncomfortable, right? And especially if you live in a state where marijuana is legal and teens are really starting to use on a much more open basis. You'll hear all the time, well, you drink wine, I can smoke pot. And having a response to that's important. And one of those responses is it's completely appropriate for us to have two different codes of conduct in the substances space, right? Because of all of that brain development, kids should not be using, and it's probably not as impactful for most adults. Most, I say, many will be. And so that idea that because I do something as your parent, you get to do it as a kid is flawed. And we want to push back on that. But then again, it is an opportunity to kind of look at what you're modeling as a parent, because we are modeling and we are teaching our kids how to consume or not consume, and when to do it and when not to do it. When we're talking to parents, we always say, if you want to do a quick test or look at your family events that involve joy, stress, and social. And if those always include alcohol, if those always include drugs, start adding some that don't. Broaden, at least at a minimum, start broadening the portfolio of ways in which you behave with your kids around. So
yeah, absolutely. And just so everyone's aware, I don't know if they're up there yet, but they will be up there soon. If not, we do have guides on how to have these discussions with your teens. Both, we have an elementary guide, we have a middle school guide, and we have a high school guide. They will all be up on the Herren Project website. If they're not already up there, they'll be up there soon.
those can be invaluable, truly.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that question is on it, what you just brought up with what if, do I share my own personal story? Do I not? If my child calls me out on my own behavior, how do I manage that? They're all in the guide.
That's great. Really important.
Yep.
Anything else out there? Okay.
Okay, great. Well, thank
All
you
right.
so much for doing this, Debbie. This was awesome. And thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. I have personally in my prevention work been a Chris Herren and Chris Herren's organization fan for a long time. You guys do such powerful work across the spectrum, and it is a pleasure to be in partnership with you guys.
Same.
So yeah. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.